My guest today has spent over 50 years inside other people's heartbeats. He's a pretty interesting guy. He once saved a patient's life with nothing but a needle. He also bought one of the first Audi R8s in the country. This guy happens to also be my dad. This is Dr. Angas Hamer, the heart's electrician, and this is Driven. So you might find we look pretty alike.
I don't have a beard.
You don't have a beard? Have you ever had a beard? You had a moustache once, didn't you? I think you did once upon a time. It was a bit of a grotty moustache. But believe it or not, my third guest of this whole podcast is actually my dad, which, as you can probably see, we are similar looking. And, podcast's still going well. It's not all a disaster. I haven't run out of people at episode 3. I've managed to get Dad on because I think you have a pretty interesting story. And, I want to sort of show, I think the podcast Driven is pretty angled towards people that have had a pretty awesome career and worked really hard. And I think you definitely have done that. And I respect your career a lot and what you've done. And I wanted to share your story and a little bit of car flair in there as well, but go through it all. But so basically, I want to start at the start. I'm going to throw you in the deep end. How did your career begin? How did you end up where you are today? Give me the rundown from the start.
Okay, so I was at a time of the beginning of the baby boomers, and we had a very privileged, the whole Australian community then, I think, was blessed by prosperity of Australia in the 5 to 10 years after the war. And as I went through school and got to year 12, which was was called matriculation at the time. I did well enough to get into Melbourne University, and but then I had to decide what I wanted to do. So there was some streaming into more arts versus science, but I was in the science group. And so I had to think of, and university was also free, which meant that you had, very little reason not to go there and get into tertiary education. There was sort of no financial constraints, so different today. But so I had an open choice. I didn't want to do general science because that was just sort of not really particularly interesting. And despite the fact that nobody in my extended family had ever gone into medicine or been a doctor, I thought that it looked like medicine was discovering new things and advancing rapidly. And there must be something, I thought, in medicine that I would enjoy doing. And if you become a doctor, you can be a people person or not. If you want to be a family GP and interact with people every day, you can. If you want to never see a person other than when they're asleep, you become an anaesthetist. Or if you go into pathology, you can hide in a corner and do your stuff. So I felt I was a people person, or I wanted to be. And it looked at the time as if cardiology, the studies of the heart and the circulation, were advancing rapidly. So I chose to go into medicine because I thought there would be something there that would attract my interest and align with how I sort of saw the world. The other interest, apart from general medicine, why I went into cardiology, as is often happens, is that you're influenced by people that you admire. And as a student at Melbourne University, I then went on to do my residency and stuff at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And at the time, they had some very prominent and leading cardiologists who were sort of taking the care of heart attacks and other things forward at a rapid pace. And so I sort of, although I did the different disciplines, going through the emergency department and neurology and all that other kind of stuff, it was really cardiology that got me motivated and going. So that's how I got into cardiology, and then just rode the wave over time with the scientific advancements. And what's happened in cardiology is that, when I first started, managing heart attacks and strokes were the biggest killer in the society. and that's sort of come, that's still present, but we can save a lot more lives these days, and it's not quite as much of a death sentence.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like obviously Australia, England, and America is probably the leaders in world sort of advancements in medicine, especially cardiology in America. And obviously I think I remember before my time, you were you did a little stint in LA, is that right? And obviously you had my sister, Kristen, over there. And so you went and had a bit of a taste of the US, medicine scene over there. What did you learn over there?
Well, it was still sort of the done thing to finish your graduate studies and then do postgraduate studies before you continued, with your career. And so a lot of people would deliberately go over to the UK and join the National Health Service over there, where particularly if they were surgeons, they had so much work that they would learn all the surgical techniques very rapidly. America had more technology advances and things like that. So in the expanding area of cardiology, I went over there to learn new skills and things. And the idea was that you'd bring them back to Australia. And, if you came back within a 3 to 5 year period, your godfathers, the people that had been supporting you up to that time, would ensure that you came back and got a good job and were recognised for the new techniques that you developed. And so that reason I was interested in a part of cardiology which was to do with the electrical side of the heart, rhythm problems and sudden death and that kind of stuff. So I went to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center over in Los Angeles and studied there for 3 years, learning new techniques of how to study the electrical features of the heart, and then came back and initially had a job with my mentor back at Royal Melbourne Hospital, and it went from there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did a little bit of research, believe it or not, before this, and I know I've always been sort of very interested in your career, and I've asked you questions about the heart, and I know there's a crossover between my previous life, which was a mechanic, and you diagnose, you look at something in an engine. For me, was my sort of my bag, and obviously a heart was for you. And it's interesting to learn, especially before this, I was sort of looking at the 3 sort of areas of the heart that you can specialise in. Obviously, one being the plumbing, which is probably the rock star cowboy stuff, which is, the stents, and people have a heart attack, a blocked artery or something like that. Is that right? And then obviously you've got the electrical side, which is really fascinating. I don't know much about, obviously. And then is it more the imaging side as well? And so you're the electrician. Is that basically the go?
So the techniques I learnt over in Los Angeles were to do with how to study the electrical system of the heart. And that's basically done by, passing electrode catheters up through the blood vessels into the heart and measuring the electrical signals. And then there was also a technique where you could stimulate the heart and see if you could trip it into a rhythm disturbance that you could study further. So initially we just did those studies and we learnt about the rhythm problems of the heart and where they came from and that kind of stuff. But we were just observing things. We didn't know how to make a difference or treat them. We still had to go back to maybe giving medications or doing other things. But then a big change came when people discovered that, having studied the electrical systems of the heart, they could use these very same catheters that we were using to take the electrical signals, find out where the problem was coming from, and then apply heat energy, so-called radio frequency ablation, which is nowadays used for all sorts of things. But we were able to make small sort of burns inside the heart without causing any problems. But we would also destroy bad electrical circuits that were causing the problem.
So going back a little bit, so all that sounds pretty full on, and listeners are probably going, okay, a lot of words there we're not aware of, but as a basic, to sort of roll it back a bit, the heart, what is it? How does it work? Like, pretend I'm a 5-year-old, sort of explaining the electrical side of the heart and how the obviously it's the most important organ in the body. I would say, how does it operate? How does the heart work?
Well, the heartbeat is generated by electrical impulses in the heart, and that comes from the top of the heart, and then it just spreads down through electrical circuits through the heart. So it then causes the muscles to respond to the electrical signals. So you can track the top part, the muscles in the top part of the heart initially, then it goes to the bottom part of the heart. And the top part of the heart are like reservoir chambers. They store the blood momentarily, and then through valves they push it down to the bottom of the heart once you've squeezed them with the electrical signal. And then the bottom of the heart is the main pump, and that pumps it either back to the lungs or through to the rest of the body. So it's a sequence, and that produces the heartbeat.
And so obviously, typically people have a heart attack and they start to feel an immense amount of pain, and usually that's from a blockage or something. Typically, is that kind of like an artery being blocked or something? That's the most? Would that be sort of like the most common heart affected sort of? Someone falls over, they have a heart attack. Is that usually from the electrical side, or is that usually the plumbing side, like a blockage?
So that the pump, the main pumps at the bottom of the heart need to have oxygenated blood for them to operate, and they come through the coronary arteries, the tubes that supply the oxygenated blood to the pumping chamber. And usually that gets like rust in a pipe. That just gets clogged up by cholesterol and fibrous tissue and things like that. And that's the whole thing of developing coronary artery disease, which is you get these sort of blockages, or you get this sort of gunk and stuff stored in the arteries, which narrow them. So if they're narrowed, then there can be a lack of blood flow during exercise or other activities, which gives you chest pain from the lack of flow to the muscle. It's like a muscle ache. But sometimes these obstructions to the artery, they can suddenly break, the surface can break. And if you break the surface, then your clot mechanism says, I've got to, it's like you cut yourself and you start bleeding. You rely on your clotting system to stop the bleeding. So if these internal coronary arteries fracture the surface, then the clotting will start to occur on top of that fracture, trying to stop it and heal it, but that will then obstruct the actual flow through that artery, which then threatens the viability of the pump muscle, and that produces a massive amount of pain and threatens to kill that area of the pump muscle that it's trying to send the oxygenated blood through, which gives you a full-on heart attack, which leads to scarring and problems with the function of the heart.
And so I guess, looking at what you've done in your career, so, in terms of I keep going back to like the cowboy, the sexy stuff, maybe the guys that used to do, open heart surgery and blockages and stents and all that sort of stuff. Like, obviously you moved into a different area, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you moved into a different area where you mentioned sports and you mentioned sort of, people with that high performing athletes were fainting, right? And is that correct? And you sort of had sort of opportunities to talk to some pretty interesting people that from face value were pretty fit and pretty, as fit as can be, ate well, trained well, high performing people. And then they had these anomalies where they would faint or have heart-related issues, which you sort of worked out. Tell me about that and that sort of period of your career.
Well, just before that, I'll sort of try and tell you how I got there. So when I was doing postgraduate studies, I was interested in one of the consequences of what we've just talked about, which is, blockages of arteries, having a heart attack, scar tissue and dead muscle and things like that, is that can actually cause an electrical storm or virtually a cardiac arrest. And so you have your heart attack and then for a period of time, you're under a major threat of that going on to cause a cardiac arrest. And sometimes that cardiac arrest can even occur in a home or away from hospital before you've had time to be rescued and taken to the hospital. So I was interested in people who'd had heart attacks from what we've just talked about, who had this electrical instability, and in the weeks and months after their heart attack might suddenly they might go home, they've sort of recovered, they've been saved, but they then have a cardiac arrest during their recovery. So I did a study on people who'd had heart attacks at the hospital, and we did electrical stimulation of their heart using the techniques I've talked about to see if there was any instability of their heart rhythm, which could predict that they might be going to have a cardiac arrest. So all of that's to do with, blacking out or losing consciousness, which can occur obviously during a cardiac arrest. But there was a general thing of what's called syncope, which is sudden loss of consciousness, which is not permanent, but fainting or other reasons. So a rhythm can cause you to lose your blood pressure and pass out, but also the common fainting can do it as well. So I was sort of going down this track of studying people with cardiac arrests into more generally people who faint or pass out. Is it due to a rhythm problem, or is it just this reflex that so many people in the community have when, if they're stimulated in certain ways by certain triggers, they can be prone to fainting. And so I was more interested in, why do people faint, what triggers it, and how we can manage it or treat it. Because even if it's not going to end their life to have a faint, they can obviously hurt themselves or damage things if they pass out in a very awkward situation. And it's very scary. So they want to know, why are they having blackouts and what can be done about it. So that's where I sort of got into that field.
And then so you had sports, high-performing sports people, obviously, I'm not going to say names or anything, but people that, again, face value were very fit. And, it's funny for us to think about, you go for a run, you're a high-performing athlete, you eat well, and you could have this issue where it's either genetic or you actually overwork yourself. Is that correct? Where you could have some fainting episodes or something along those lines. Is that what, when you're doing the tilt table tests and stuff? Explain all that sort of.
Yeah, well, we're trying to distinguish losing consciousness from a rhythm problem, from this abnormal reflex that many of us have, in that in certain circumstances we can be triggered by stress into a faint, from which we recover from. So part of doing the heart studies on these people was to distinguish between a rhythm, which may threaten their life, causing them to have a blackout, and simple fainting, which is a problem but is not life-threatening. So we were trying to sort of divide them into different areas. And people who faint often start fainting when they're young, so they could otherwise be perfectly fit and well, and there's sort of no particular profile of these people other than they're normal, but under some circumstances they faint. Whereas people who have rhythm problems that cause them to black out usually have something fundamentally wrong with their heart. It's not normal. And we look at the heart through different tests, including ultrasounds and things like that, and we can recognise as problems, mechanical or electrical, that predispose them to abnormal rhythms. So we sort of divide them into different groups.
It's obviously very technical, and I love it because it's diagnosing someone and the issues is sort of like a passion. It's fun for me, but I'm sure I want to just change gears a little bit, and I want to ask you a bit of an opinion sort of question here, and your personal opinion on this stuff. So obviously these days, health, fitness, self-health, it's a multi-million-dollar, if not billion-dollar market. And what I mean is, let's talk about wearables. Let's talk about Apple iWatches. Let's talk about Whoop straps. Let's talk about Oura rings. So all of these devices you can wear these days, which have ECGs on them, and they monitor your heart rate and they monitor your health, and they're all connected to your phone. And these things are really amazing, obviously, in terms of technology. And then sort of moving into probably more interesting things like Ozempic and Mounjaro and these sort of drugs that are weight loss drugs that also have a secondary sort of effect. This sort of, I guess the question, like, are we are we healthier now because of these things, or are we possibly getting more medical anxiety, or are we just a bit more obsessed? What's your opinion of all this stuff that's come out at the moment? Like, for example, you can watch your ECG 10 times a day if you want. Do you think that benefits people? Are we healthier because of these things?
Well, I think if you're perfectly healthy and normal, then, having some sort of device that will tell you what your heart rate is at any time, will also plot, the changes in your normal heart rate over time as to whether you sort of, tend to run a low or a high, or does it all sort of act normally. That sort of thing, I think initially if you get one of these devices, can be a fascination. But I think after a while, and there are health programs, as you know, that you can use the watch for, and it tells you what time to go to bed and what time to wake up, and what your heart rate did overnight, and is that okay, and that sort of thing. So, and you might say, well, I can tell I'm fit because my heart rate's lower than usual, and all that sort of thing. So you can get really deep into these things. But they're also very useful from a clinical point of view, because it go back to the case where we're wanting to see whether there's an abnormal rhythm, try and detect it.
Yeah.
And in the past, we would have done ECG monitors where you have to go somewhere and have it hooked up for 24 hours, and you have to wear it, and you can't have a shower or a bath with it on, and that kind of stuff. With these new devices, obviously, you can monitor what your heart rate is and whether the rhythm is normal, and even record your ECG periodically. But that would be mainly confined not so much to the people who are a bit nerdy about what's going on with their health. They would probably be directed to do that by a physician because they're presented with a possible rhythm problem. And these devices, there's been hundreds of studies now looking at these devices and how good they are at truly detecting rhythms rather than false alarms. And they've been very, very useful. There's one common rhythm called atrial fibrillation, which can even bother normal people, but otherwise can be associated with other issues. And the problem with atrial fibrillation is that it can lead to clotting in your heart, which can then go to the brain and other places and cause a stroke. So you don't want to have a stroke from atrial fibrillation that's undetected when you're in your young or middle years. We need to know that you've got this, and therefore you're then put on blood thinners and that kind of stuff to stop you having a stroke. So to use these devices to detect atrial fibrillation, for example, they've been shown to be very reliable and very good because the algorithms that they use to detect the abnormal rhythm have become pretty perfected. If we suspect that they might be having these abnormal rhythms and there's a threat, like a stroke or something from it, then these have been fantastic help in detecting these situations.
So we should get a Apple Watch to Apple iWatch to sponsor the podcast. What do you reckon? Everyone get on it. Discount code Angas Hamer?
Well, I mean, we can't. We're not. We're sort of. We do look at people who are at risk of having atrial fibrillation, and there's some people that unfortunately, for various reasons, do have a mini stroke or some sort of suggestion, and then you say, okay, why is this person having it? So you get them to wear a watch or something like that, and to see whether they had this atrial fibrillation, because then you can do something to make sure it never happens again.
I guess with medicine, obviously, and I did mention Ozempic and all that sort of stuff, like obviously there are some headline things that are happening and people can get access to some pretty awesome stuff. And say, for example, Ozempic, for example, has, obviously a weight loss drug, but it doubles as a blood pressure. Is that correct? Or no, blood pressure, what is it? It's for...
Well, it affects your glucose levels and it helps with diabetes.
Diabetes, right. And so, it's interesting. People are so much more. Would you say that people these days are so much more knowledgeable about their health and what access they have, as opposed to say the 80s, where they would come to a doctor specifically and they wouldn't probably be as generally educated in medicine and their own health? Would you agree with that or not?
Well, I think people. I'm not sure that they're more health conscious. I think they've always. There's always been a proportion of the population who don't care a damn about their health, and they might even have a family history of heart disease and things, and they go off there and still, push the boundaries. They don't sort of, it doesn't, it's not going to affect me, but my poor dad died of a heart attack. So, some people who ignore the health warnings, other people embrace them, maybe over-embrace them. But I think the biggest thing is that in so many areas, we have developed new things that actually make a difference. And the good thing is, for years and years, we've treated high cholesterol because we believe that reduces the amount of clogging up of the arteries and other things. But we initially had medications that had lots of side effects and probably only sort of took your cholesterol down by 10 or 20%. And that just wasn't enough to make a difference.
Yeah, and on that, going back to the 80s, for example, I remember talking to you a few times about, let's say, my Poppy, my grandfather, right? I remember during the 80s, you were saying, medicine and advancements it was very quick, throughout that period, and he had a heart attack in, I guess, before I was born, so in 85, I imagine. And I remember you were saying something on the lines of the medication that was coming out, every year or every half a year was like, there was potentially advancement that could have saved him, which is tragic, within the year before. Is that like, how was the 80s? Was that a sort of a golden era of medication and learning and for you sort of advancements?
Well, it was certainly the start of his actual problem from the heart attack was he then had such a weak pump that he had heart failure, which causes breathlessness and incapacity and so on. The pump just isn't pumping well enough. And so, but this is going to happen throughout time, is that the new discoveries for some people will just come that moment too late, or not be effective and that sort of thing. So his case was he sort of missed out by a month or two from having a breakthrough medication that came out at the time. Now the type of medication was called an ACE inhibitor, and it basically helped patients who had heart failure. Prior to that, we had Digitalis, which was been around for 250 years, and we had diuretics, which are used for many, many things, but just keep the fluid under control. But neither the Digitalis or the diuretics actually made you live any longer with your heart failure. They just made you feel better. So this was an ACE inhibitor that came on the market out of America and Europe, and it was the first medication to be shown to actually perhaps allow you to live with your heart failure a bit longer. And it came out 6 months after he died. So, this is always going to happen. There's going to be people who just weren't in the right place at the right time.
So going back to the 80s, give me some highlight stuff that, like, for example, what can you fix today that you couldn't in the 80s, for example, like from a medical perspective in your field? Well,
let's go back to coronary artery disease. In the when I first graduated in the 70s, if you had a heart attack, you just were put in bed for 6 weeks. You just rest. There was nothing else that could be done. There's certainly nothing that to sort of repair the heart attack and so on. You'd had an event and you just had to rest up for 6 weeks, and there was no other treatment. And then, particularly out of America, came the idea of this coronary bypass grafting, whereby you could bypass the blockages and feed oxygenated blood to the muscle that was starving of blood. And if the muscle was already dead, it didn't do any difference. But there are other parts where the narrowings were still causing a lack of oxygen to the heart muscle, and that could make a big difference to jump over the blockages with the bypass. And when it first came out, it was still thought to be a dangerous operation. So we were going around the ward to people that had heart attacks who might require, be candidates for surgery, coronary bypass surgery. But we'd have some rule of thumb that if they're over the age of 65, they're probably too old to have this treatment. So we'd gone from 6 weeks in bed to you might be able to have surgery, but as long as you're not over 65 years of age. And then we got into, by the time we got to the 80s, the big breakthrough was that this idea of putting in metal stents to open up the blockages rather than having bypass surgery became an equal competitor. So we're talking about it was first shown in the late 70s, but in the early 80s, everybody was now looking at doing this angioplasty, as they called it, with stenting, with or without stenting. It was initially just with a balloon, and then they added the metal stents later on.
What's a stent? Well, how does that work?
So it's like it's a metal tube, if you like, and it's on a balloon, so that you put it into the coronary arteries, feed it into the coronary artery where the narrowing is, through the arterial blood vessels, often in the leg or nowadays in the arm, through the radial artery, and you feed it into the area of the coronary circulation through the aorta, where the narrowing is, and then at the point of the narrowing, you blow up the balloon, which expands the metal tube, and it sits there, keeping the artery open. It's sort of like a scaffolding, and that became, and it still is, a very popular way of opening up the arteries in the long term without having to go to bypass surgery. But still, bypass surgery has a role. So there's certain patients where there's too many narrowings, or they're diabetic, or they have other sort of issues whereby the value of the angioplasty and stenting is not quite so suitable for them, and that they're better to have the bypass surgery.
So, I mean, again, lots of technical stuff. I love it, and I guess I want to just sort of focus and bring it back a little bit more to you, and obviously, 40 plus, 50 plus years in the medical field. How many years now, roughly?
Yeah, 50.
50. So 50 years, dedicated to one organ, I guess. I know you've touched on it previously, but do you have any regrets on that? Like, would you have changed or done any other field of medicine if you had your time again?
No. No. There was, there's a small number of people, and I know I've, some of them are my friends who've gone into one branch of medicine and then just sort of got sick of it and changed over. Like, there's one guy I know who was a urologist, which he was doing with the urinary system and the plumbing and so on like that. He got sick of that and he became a radiologist and started looking at X-rays and things. So I don't know why people change their things, but it's not an easy thing to do. But I never thought of that. Yeah.
And so obviously, to bring it back to, anyone in their career, and you might have, I've had a massive career change, as when I turned 30, pretty much, or just before, I had a massive career change, and it was because I, made the wrong decision maybe not made the wrong decision, but had done something that I knew was certainly a hobby, not a passion, right? And I obviously think for you, your job has always been a complete and utter privilege and passion for you. I see that. And I guess going back to yourself as a 20-year-old, 22-year-old, and everyone looks at doctors, I think, and obviously you've got this aura of knowledge and godlike aura, I have to say, it's you guys are where everyone looks to in the time of need. And so you earn that, right? You don't just finish your degree and then you go and have this piece of paper and everyone looks at you for answers. Like it's a very long journey to get to where you are today. And I would say even those, say you're 10 years after uni, explain what that time was like for you. And, you don't get paid much. You work in mental hours and you're still following your mentor. And like, how was that period for you and how tough was it?
Yeah, I think if you're in a specialty, particularly that's got, quite exciting advances and that kind of stuff, I think it's quite capable of keeping you interested, in the long term. I think that, good doctors sort of get rewards from their successes, but they also, there are times when they have a bad, not a bad day, but, where things don't quite go as expected. There might be some complication from a procedure or that kind of stuff. And you can't ignore that. And so you're always sort of re-rating yourself or benchmarking yourself. And I know when I was doing electrical studies of the heart that there would be a day where I was trying to do what we called an ablation, to treat and cure a rhythm. And you knew that if you were successful and you cured that person's rhythm, then they're obviously their life would be different and changed, and that they would be grateful for what you did. Now, you didn't sort of overrate yourself in the sense, saying, I'm successful in 90% of the cases, therefore, I should be honoured for that. But you do interact with your patient and say, if it's a day that you've done a successful procedure and they're going to benefit from it, you do go home and say, well, that was a good day. But on the other hand, I've had days where I have been frank and had to explain to patients that, what we planned to do didn't work out, or there was a complication. Some of the procedures I was doing, in very rare cases, if you didn't quite get it right, you might be resulting in damage to the electrical system that needed a pacemaker, and that would be the last thing you wanted to do, is to end up with a poor result like that, and you had to sort of go through that with your patient. But there were many times when I would go to other colleagues that were doing the same thing, and I'd benchmark myself. I said, look, hey, I had this problem today. What do you think? Do you think there could have been a better thing I did, and that sort of thing? So as long as you're prepared to judge yourself and benchmark yourself, rather than just assume that you're infallible, I think you continue to get value out of what you're doing. Yeah.
Who taught you to deal with the ones, the people that you couldn't save? How did you learn how to, get in your car? You worked at Epworth, you worked at the Austin Repat. You drive 20 minutes home, and we all do it. We all leave work, but how do you prepare yourself to come home, walk into me, mum, my sister? How do you prepare yourself from a day where you've just completely been up against the wall? You've not necessarily made the wrong decision, but it's out of your hands. Like, how do you deal with that? How did you switch that off and come home? And who taught you to do that?
I don't think anyone taught me. I mean, in medicine, from the very beginning, even if you're a resident or an intern or something like that, and you're dealing with patients, and let's say they, in the cardiac field, there were some people who would have a cardiac arrest, and they would still be alive. They'd been, resuscitated from it, but they'd had brain damage. And so they come into ICU, and you continue to support their heart and their circulation. But then you've got to have a difficult discussion with the family about whether you keep them on life support and things, or it's withdrawn. So from the very beginning, you have those situations where you can't fix the problem. So I think you are thrown. I'm sure that these days there's much better support and training for people, but I remember just being thrown in the deep end, really, and in terms of developing those skills to relate with other human beings about situations that weren't going to end well.
Did you have a mentor that you used to talk to and to sort of, go through these kind of questions with, or did you have someone that sort of guided you through? There's obviously the arithmetic and the book smart side of this job or your job, but then there's obviously that emotional connection part, and I think a lot of people who are very book smart don't connect the emotional intelligence part very well together, right? Did you have someone that helped you ever connect that and sort of deal with your emotions and deal with like your mental health through that time and all that sort of stuff?
No, there's nothing. There was no one sort of official, as I said. And I think you've just got to. It's the type of person you are. Now you could just totally just ignore the thing, just switch off. I'm getting in the car, coming home. I haven't done anything to resolve, my bad day. I'm not. No one at home is going to be interested in talking me through it either. So you can be that sort of personality, or you can be a personality who's really concerned about and self-interested in how did I handle the situation, how am I going to handle it again in the future. And I think you've just got to think that through. And as I said before, you might, within your discipline, you're probably going to have a couple of work people who do the same thing. and must have gone through the same situation. So you just talk to them and learn from how they've handled it and develop it. But there's no sort of angel on your shoulder or all that kind of stuff to help you.
So there's the community of medical practitioners sort of, I guess you're always self-analysing and comparing notes. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and look, the mental health of practitioners is probably still not supported enough, but certainly in the past it was, everyone was fending for themselves.
Another question sort of, I guess, with your career and a lot of people have to keep relevant, right? And I think the medical field is, I have some memories, and we'll touch on this in a second, cars and bits and pieces. But I remember, for me in finance broking, we are constantly pushed to be compliant, and we have, we update ourselves with regulations and training and stuff like that. And I remember you used to jump in your car, and it's funny because now I jump in my car and I listen to a podcast or listen to some music, and it's usually my relaxed time. But I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you used to jump in your car and you'd have tapes and CDs from, say, America or England, other practitioners or studies that you used to listen to in the car. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And memory. And so was that like the old school way of keeping relevant? Like, was your interest, you used to listen to these case studies and learn about things that may have happened or tried and tested in other countries or even in Australia, the old cassette tapes. Was that your way of learning? And then obviously you would have to reinvent yourself every 5 to sort of 7 years or so, wouldn't you? Like, because to keep relevant, how did that work? How does that work? I mean, there's no textbook, right, to sort of be a relevant doctor.
Well, it's changed over time. These days, to continue to be licensed as a medical practitioner and practice your specialty and things like that, your medical education requirements, which they've developed over the last few years, are very stringent. You've got to do certain things, score points, and submit your log, if you like, of the last 12 months to the College of Physicians, and there are other groups that you can qualify, and they've got to approve that your medical education, that you've done enough things, and that could be attending journal clubs during the week, or if in my case, cardio-surgical things where I just we do case studies and or read journals, or the old days listen to tapes in the car. I didn't really sort of remember much from the tapes in the car because I guess I was concentrating on driving at the same time, and it probably wasn't a good thing to be trying to do two things at once. But it was just a way of if you're listening to someone talk about what you could otherwise obtain by looking up a heart journal. But certainly you can't continue to practice these days, and it sometimes forces people into early retirement if they can't maintain their medical education. And it's obviously much more difficult in private practice, where you're having less formal educational sessions, and your only motivation is for you to get the journal out and read it and keep up. But how to keep up with the expanded knowledge is an enormous task. But no, it's very regulated now, and the thing is that the colleges and things do it because otherwise the government said we'll step in and do it ourselves, and nobody wants the government to come in and tell you your requirements for practicing medicine. So the college do it instead.
Obviously, you've stood between people and potential death for close to 50 years, and you've been the person in certain cases where people have looked to for answers and for solutions, including other medical staff, and you've made the right call sometimes, obviously, a lot of the time, and saved people's lives. And not asking the bad times. I want to talk about the good times. How did that feel? Like, what is the feeling in your body when you've made a call to save someone's life? And how do you feel like a little bit godlike? How do you feel?
I think we get back to what we started saying, was that when you go into medicine, there are so many branches of medicine. I think you've got to try and make the best fit to what you're like as a person. And without disparaging anyone, if you want to be a dermatologist and work from 8 till 6 and there's no such thing as a medical emergency, basically. Or if there, other than allergic reactions or something, which would end up in the ER anyway. You can potter around there and how you relate to your patients or how you deal with, serious things. You're probably not going to come across it. It's a pretty benign way of doing medicine. On the other hand, if you're a family physician or you're a cardiologist, where there's or even you ICU person or emergency room person, where there's stuff going on all the time, and high stress stuff, that may suit you. I think the right thing is to make sure that you match what you're like as a person with what branch of medicine you practice. And yes, it could be exhilarating. It could be there were ups and downs. You could have a successful day and you'd saved someone's life or made a difference to them. Or you could have other days where you tried but, you were overwhelmed and you went with the roller coaster. So some people are into that and some people, it's not what they want to do.
Do you remember a time where you made a gut call and you saved someone's life? Like your most memorable, positive outcome?
Yes.
Tell me about it.
Well, okay. There was one case about 4 or 5 years ago when I was on ward service and we had this woman who was in the ward and I can't remember the reason, but she collected fluid around the heart, which is a medical emergency. And the fluid was stopping the heart from beating. And normally you arrange for them to go into theatre or somewhere like that and you use an ultrasound and you put a needle in and you drain the fluid out, and that can make a dramatic difference and potentially save their life. Now, in this situation, in the ward situation, it wasn't possible to get her into theatre or into the cath lab or the ward or the area to do the procedure. And so, she was there and someone had to do something now in the ward because there was no other facility. And I'd actually been talking to one of my colleagues who had experience in the past of patients with tuberculosis who often got fluid around their heart. And he said what they used to do, in South Africa or wherever he was brought up, is they'd just go and stick a needle in at the bedside and sort of know where to stick it and which direction to stick it and take the fluid out and things. So I said, well, I haven't done this before, but give me some gloves, give me that sort of stuff. And I just grabbed a needle and stuck it in there in front of everyone. It was pretty stupid thing to do, I suppose. But we got into the right place, pulled the fluid out, and she was saved. So that's been really cowboy stuff. But we didn't have any choices.
But it's critical thinking, right? And this is the thing where I guess the job would be difficult because you've got a textbook that you should abide by and read, and there's a step-by-step process, I'm sure, to a lot of this.
I broke all the protocols, absolutely.
Yeah, and again, I don't think that would be frowned upon because the outcome worked, right? And even if it didn't work, what you've explained to me seems like medicine's a trial and error process, right? You have to try something different to get a different outcome if it's, if the normal way is not working. And so I respect that, and I think that's something that, if it works or doesn't work, it's the only way we figure it out is we learn, right? And everyone's a guinea pig, but when you're on death's door, you've got to take a chance to see if it's going to work, right? I like that. Cars, right? Let's bring it back to cars. I have some pretty awesome memories of a certain type of car that you still own to this day, and it's a Jaguar E-Type. It's beautiful. Enzo Ferrari once said that that's probably the most beautiful car ever built, which is a big thing for an Italian car maker to say about a British heritage car. Tell me about the Jaguar E-Type. Tell me about how you fell in love with it and how it motivated you to get it. Okay,
so at the time I was just an intern at the hospital, and I was we'd just got a pay rise from working 120 hours a week for nothing to something half reasonable. So I had a bit of money in the pocket, and I had a very close friend who was running a prestige motor vehicle sort of service shop and things like that, called Jag Performance Centre. So he had many different cars, but he focused on Jaguar. So that's when he sort of persuaded me to start looking around for an E-type jag, and we're talking about the mid-70s, right? And but prior to that, we had a pathologist at Royal Melbourne Hospital when I was a student there who had a black E-type. He'd had it from new, a 64 E-type, Series 1, and it had there were two colours of upholstery that you could get with the black Jaguar. One was a bright blood-coloured red, and the other was a darker red.
You'd seen enough red at that point in your
Anyway,
life, I imagine.
and he was a pathologist who used to make all of our students faint and things by demanding we had to come down to autopsies that he did. So he wasn't much fun, but I admired his. And he also worked at the coroner's courts. But I thought
So he was like, "Come down, have a look at some dead people. Let's have a chat."
That's right. Yeah. So anyway, I used to notice that this black E-type with the blood red upholstery was parked, outside the pathology department of the Royal Melbourne Hospital. So I said, my friend had said, "You should get a Jag E-type." I said, "I'm going to see if I can buy it." And initially he wouldn't buy it, but then he fell in love with an XJS, which was supposed to be the E-type substitute, and bought one. So I bought it off him. So in those days in the mid 70s, I bought it for $6,000, and I think that was a fair price for it. And so I've been the second owner ever since. So that's where we are. So it's, as I said, I know its complete history. Interestingly, he got registered in 1964 when it first came here through Bryson's, and they were up to the H's in the number plates at the time. And he had a wife called Hazel, and so he managed to get a number plate HZL 800, normally through the system. So he at least pleased his wife by having her name on the number plate. Anyway, it's still registered as HZL 800, and I've never had it on a club permit plate, just simply because I've kept the original number plate, which I think is, a bit of history, that's all.
And you've always tinkered. You always played with cars, and one of my earliest memories, I think I've told you this more recently, and I worked this out. I think I was 3, and based on the state of the car. So we used to have the shed where you'd have that car, and it was gutted. It was, you were restoring it at the time, and I figured this as earliest memories. I was holding the steering wheel. There was nothing in the car; it was just a frame. But I had a steering wheel, and I was playing with it. And you were under the car, as always, working on it. And I reckon you said to me that point where it was at was probably 87 or 80, maybe 86, 87. I would have been 2 or 3. So that's one of my earliest memories, is sitting in that car.
Thanks.
And playing with the steering wheel. I remember it still. I can visualise it. And so, I think our love for cars, and hence the podcast driven, there's a lot of different meanings to this podcast, but it always comes back to cars, and I think that's common passion that I think I've had since I was probably 2, and hence why we're here. But you love working on cars. I wouldn't say very well.
Thanks.
There's been a few times we've had to, you've given me a quick phone call and you're like, "Hey, I've pulled this thing off," and I'm like, "Why are you touching that? You're not meant to touch that.
Yeah, well,
don't pull that off."
I mean, to explain why you were in a body shell, we have to explain that when I had the car for the first 3 or 4 years, there wasn't that much wrong with it. It'd done about 60,000.
There's never anything wrong with it, and then you pull it apart, and there's everything wrong.
I know. So, but then, inevitably there's a couple of things you want to fix, and it's that usual thing. You start pulling it apart and saying, "Oh, okay, there's something else that needs to be fixed, or I'd like to repaint that." Anyway, so, and particularly when it went over to my uncle, who's also no car nut, on his farm in South Australia when I was in America for the 3 years, he just had it in a hay shed, and the poor old thing sort of went a bit further downhill, which was even more incentive to let's strip this back, let's fix this, let's make it concours and restore everything. So it ended up being bare metal shell and starting from scratch, and as you know, that took 20 years to sort of put it back together again. And the final thing just before the turn of the century was that I either was told that I had to get more professional help to put it back together, or there would be a divorce. So, or I'd have to sell it. So we finally got it back on the road, as you know, in the just after 2000.
I feel like we've all had that moment. Before we finish up, run me through your cars that you've owned to the best of your memory.
Okay. Well, the first one I got as a gift from my mother, it was a VW, Volkswagen, and it only lasted a few months before someone ran a red light and wrote it off. Then I drove a Renault, which belonged to my grandmother. So these are all, I know. It's actually a Renault Gordini, which meant it actually went a little bit faster than an ordinary Renault. But I had that for a few years. And
Porsche era?
beg your pardon?
Porsche era?
Yes, okay. And then I, through the friend who actually put me on to getting an E-Type, he had another very good friend who was a well-known panel beater and restorer of prestige cars, who was selling his 1972 911 T, 2.4 T, orange, tangerine orange one, and that was a beautiful car, and I had that for about 4 or 5 years. But then I went back to commonplace cars for a few, anything, just family-orientated cars.
Carrera 4, air-cooled.
Oh, yeah, okay. So later on we get to, I started getting into Audis or Audi S's, RS's, that kind of stuff, but also, so a 993 Carrera 4 for a few years. And then
you nearly got divorced by buying a Audi R8.
Yeah, and then when they came out in 2007, I got one of the first Audi R8s, the V8, and I had that for 7 years. So yeah, I've had some wonderful cars.
Doctors, they have a passion for cars. You obviously did, and you saw it, and that Jaguar motivated you. You got your pay rise. I think that's worn off on me. I've definitely bought a lot of cars in my day, and a lot of friends will say that. The final question I want to ask you, and I'm big into number plates too, but tell me about your number plate, Lub Dub.
Okay. So in about the mid to late 70s, I bought a new Audi at that time, and I decided that I wanted to get a specialty plate, and Lub Dub, L-U-B-D-U-B, is the if you buy a stethoscope, right, a Littmann stethoscope for listening to the heart, they describe in the literature that comes with the stethoscope what the normal heartbeat should sound like, and they sound a normal heartbeat should sound like Lub Dub when you're listening with a stethoscope. So I thought that would be cute to get a number plate called Lub Dub.
Very well thought out. Dad, love you very much. Thank you so much for coming on here and telling your story. And thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed something and stuck with us there, but we'll see you next time. Thank you.